It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning again, everyone. Before we leave Mother's Day behind for a lot of wilting flowers and binging on chocolates, I want to read a few lines from the historian Heather Cox Richardson, who writes that excellent and widely read Substack newsletter about how what most people don't know about the origins of the holiday should, in her opinion, be more widely known. Before we get to Heather Cox before we get to Kimberlé Crenshaw this hour, and also Jessica Gross, who has another take on Mother's Day at the end of the show. But here's what Heather Cox Richardson wants us to know about the history of Mother's Day. She writes, if you Google the history of Mother's Day, the internet will tell you that Mother's Day began in 1908 when Anna Jarvis decided to honor her mother. But Mother's Day, with the apostrophe not in the singular spot, but in the plural, so think about that for a minute, right? We think of Mother's Day, mother apostrophe S, but Heather Cox Richardson says it was originally mother's plural, apostrophe, Mother's Day, with the apostrophe not in the singular spot, but in the plural, actually started in the 1870s, when the sheer enormity of the death caused by the Civil War and the Franco-Prussian War convinced writer and reformer Julia Ward Howe that women must take control of politics from the men who had permitted such carnage. Mother's Day was not designed to encourage people to be nice to their mothers. It was part of women's effort to gain power, to change society. Just a few more lines. The Civil War years taught naive Americans what mass death meant in the modern era. Soldiers who had marched off to war with fantasies of heroism discovered that newly invented long-range weapons turned death into tortured anonymity. Men were trampled into blood-soaked mud, piled like cordwood in ditches, or withered into emaciated corpses after dysentery drained their lives away. I think very useful graphic description of war that people need to hear things like that every once in a while, right, from Heather Cox Richardson. So to conclude this excerpt, the women who had watched their hale and healthy men march off to war were haunted by its results. They lost fathers, husbands, sons, and brothers. The men who did come home were scarred in both body and mind. Modern war, it seemed, was not a game, but out of the war also came a new sense of empowerment. So that from Heather Cox Richardson's Mother's Day weekend Substack. Really interesting history, very worth knowing, right? And we'll talk more about Mother's Day with Jessica Gross coming up toward the end of the show. With us now, one of the most influential American thinkers of the last 40 years with her new memoir. And she's influential both by the number of people she has made think differently about things and the backlash she has drawn for doing so. Among other things in her career, Columbia and UCLA law professor Kimberlé Williams Crenshaw, gave us the terms critical race theory and intersectionality. President Trump and the movement he represents are on a mission to erase those words from public discourse as much as possible. Here's just one example. An executive order last year about artificial intelligence models that can be used by federal agencies. It says those models, quote, shall be neutral, nonpartisan tools that do not manipulate responses in favor of ideological dogmas such as DEI. By the way, it didn't mention any ideological dogmas of the right, but it continues, in the AI context, DEI includes incorporation of concepts like critical race theory, transgenderism, unconscious bias, you can't say unconscious bias, intersectionality, and systemic racism, and discrimination on the basis of race or sex, unquote, from that Trump executive order. And that's so broad, right? Trying to ban even the concept of discrimination on the basis of race or sex, in the president's words. But as you heard, he also included intersectionality and critical race theory on that list. So a little context of the moment. The book is called Backtalker, An American Memoir. It's Kimberlé Williams Crenshaw's life story, including how she was shaped by some traumas early in her life, and with great detail of how critical race theory and intersectionality came to be and what they actually mean compared to how they're used, like in that executive order. There's also the small role she played during the Clarence Thomas Anita Hill hearing way back when, and much more. As I said, Professor Crenshaw teaches law at both Columbia and UCLA. She is also co-founder and executive director of the think tank, the African American Policy Forum, and she hosts the podcast Intersectionality Matters. Professor Crenshaw, thanks for coming on with us. Thanks in advance for sharing your book with us. Welcome to WNYC today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
There are so many places we could start, but maybe for people who've maybe walked by a bookstore and seen the cover of the book, is that you and your brother as kids on the cover?
Yes, it is. It's my brother, who is Mantle Burt Crenshaw, and he was 8 years older than me. So that shows us in the honeymoon of our relationship when he was my big brother and who looked out for me and made me comfortable being who I was.
How does that shot, if it does, connect to the scholarship and advocacy that you're most known for?
Well, what I wanted the book to do, first of all, is to counter the misrepresentation of ideas like critical race theory and intersectionality as somehow un-American, as foreign, as an import from some other place, and ground it in the lived experiences of a girl growing up in the cusp of the women's movement, in the middle of the civil rights movement, and squarely in the 20th century and in the 21st century. So it's telling a story of coming of age of both myself, but of a consciousness around America and its race and gender hierarchies.
On the development of critical race theory, you say it came out of a workshop in 1988 involving you and others. What was the context at that time?
Well, at that time we were, I would say, a generation of scholars and students who were just entering the legal profession or law school just as the former barriers of race discrimination and white supremacy were breaking down. Yet, as we entered these institutions that hadn't really changed other than admitting students of color in greater numbers than they had before.
Uh-oh. I think we're having trouble, obviously, with Professor Crenshaw's line. We'll see if we can get her hooked right back up. But listeners, your questions welcome for Kimberlé Williams Crenshaw, Columbia and UCLA professor, developer of the terms critical race theory and intersectionality, among many other things she has done, and author of the new book Backtalker, an American memoir. You can call or you can text 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692. And maybe some of you have been personally influenced by the concept of intersectionality or critical race theory. Maybe some of you teach them, because that's where some of the controversy is, right? Should these things be taught? And if so, how? So teachers, anybody who's been influenced, anybody who has a critical take, that's also okay, and has a question around that. 212-433-WNYC, call or text 212-433-9692. I think we have Professor Crenshaw back. You're there, right?
I am here.
So sorry about whatever's going on with the line. Can you give the listeners, because I think this would be useful, even now, the basic definition of critical race theory as you actually mean the term?
Well, yeah, and let me say this first, because there is a lot of confusion about whether critical race theory is being taught in the schools. And too many times our focus on the definition of critical race theory forces us to obscure what the right says critical race theory is when they say it's being taught in the schools. So for them, critical race theory is conversations and instruction around race that addresses racial injustice, racial disparity, how race is viewed by those who have implicit biases. But even beyond that, critical race theory has been framed as teaching about the Montgomery bus boycott as an example of white supremacy, teaching about the Tulsa race riot as something that was motivated by racism. So effectively, anything that is about racism or racial injustice or racial power, told from a perspective that would suggest that that is unfair or un-American, has been framed as critical race theory. So I just want to be clear that I can give you a definition of critical race theory from a law perspective, but that is not what is being attacked under the ban on critical race theory, just to be clear. Now, when
Go ahead.
Talking about the fact that racial disempowerment and inequality can happen without being race specific or without saying we're doing this because we hate black people or we want to exclude brown people. Critical race theory deals with the ways that inequality is structured into our laws, into our institutions, so that if you don't pay attention to race and racial unfairness, you can still produce it. So that's what critical race theory pays attention to. And if people are confused, the best example of critical race theory as a framework is just looking at what happened with the Calais decision and how now many state legislatures are using mapping
and
strategies.
Just to bring people along, that's the recent Supreme Court decision that gutted much of the Voting Rights Act. Go ahead.
Exactly. And so, you know, the act was gutted in the morning. By the evening, legislatures were finding tactics and strategies to break up black votes. Now, did they say we don't want any black people to vote? No. Did they adopt a skin color test to get access to the voting booth? No. Well, for some people, if they didn't do either of those things, that's the end of the question. There's no racial problem. Critical race theory pays attention to the different tools that can be used given the history that we've had, the distribution of voting rights, to enact greater forms of racial exclusion. That's what critical race theorists pay attention to, particularly when it's done through law itself.
And how about intersectionality? Is it primarily a way of understanding layers of discrimination, or also broader in the sense of just describing the intersection of identities that any person might have?
More specifically, it describes the intersection of power, where that power has been structured either along gender lines or race lines, and those lines come together to create specific differential burdens for people who are subject both to racism and to sexism or other forms of discrimination. A lot of people have been told that it is identity politics on steroids, or it is a framework to make white men into the new pariah class. Nonsense. What it does acknowledge is that identities can make you vulnerable to certain forms of discrimination that exclude people with the identity that you happen to share. That is basically what anti-discrimination law is about. Intersectionality simply adds to that commitment the fact that you can be discriminated against on the basis of one or more bases at the same time. And again, just to put a point on it, a lot of the critics of intersectionality aren't really upset about the acknowledgement that you can be discriminated against based on two or more characteristics. In fact, when it serves their purposes, they make precisely those claims. There's a claim now by a white man against the New York Times That's an intersectional claim. Now, whether it's real or whether he was really discriminated as a white man is dubious, but the point is that the idea of multiple marginalization isn't what upsets the right. What upsets the right is who they perceive it advantages and who they perceive it disadvantages. It's not about intersectionality per se.
Timothy in Brooklyn, you're on WNYC with Kimberlé Williams Crenshaw. Hi, Timothy.
Hi, good morning, actually. This is a privilege to talk to Professor Crenshaw. I just wanted her to know that her ideas around intersexuality has really helped me as a public health activist shape and frame interventions that specifically target Black, gay, and bisexual men in particular communities, because very often that vulnerable population of men, particularly during the time of HIV and AIDS, had to negotiate, gay white spaces as well as Black community spaces where those identities were not necessarily always supported and accepted. So in terms of our activism, it allowed us to shape interventions to advocate thoroughly the needs for Black, gay, and bisexual men, and it has been thoroughly helpful. And I really appreciate the concept.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your work and also for calling in to clarify. Because I get these questions a lot. Well, is intersectionality just for Black women? Like, first of all, do you read? Because it is clear that intersectionality is about taking into account the ways that inequalities, the ways that marginalization have to be taken into account no matter what the context is if you're trying to address something that burdens particular populations. But because there's been such criticism, I think intentional distortion of intersectionality. It's been attacked. It has been excised, for example, from Florida's advanced placement curriculum, along with a list of all kinds of populations and topics that can no longer be discussed. So intersectionality was taken out, structural racism, queer theory was taken out, and critical race theory. And when the College Board was asked to defend its actions, it didn't say, well, we were under pressure from the right. We couldn't sell the course if we couldn't take it out. Instead, they said intersectionality was no longer useful. It had been subject to politicization, and it made no sense to include it in the course. Well, what you've just heard is how people make use of the framework. What you've heard is how our interventions might not be effective if we don't take intersectionality into account. So people all over the country and all over the world have been using this to do their work, yet the right wants to tell people that it's not a useful concept and take it away. This is an act of power and distortion. It's not an effort to try to respond to any real or significant threat, other than the threat of injustice going without being intervened against that intersectionality poses.
Francesca in the Bronx, you're on WNYC with Kimberlé Williams Crenshaw. Hi, Francesca.
Hi. Wow, it's really an honor to speak with you. So this is sort of just a thank you, I guess. When I was a school kid, I had a teacher who he was very careful to tell us the history was written by the winners, and so we needed to put a critical eye on whatever we were reading. So we had a history book, regular history book, and then he also had us reading The Strange Career of Jim Crow, for example, as supplementary material. Yeah. And this was way back in the 80s, and I really give him a lot of credit for that. And he didn't call it anything. He just called it history, So it was just American history. And I really, I struggle when I hear people complaining about teaching this. And then as a middle school teacher myself, I have passed this on to my students. And I'm really grateful that you have put words on this, because now I'm a therapist, and, I have clients where, maybe I'm working with a Black woman who is also on the autism spectrum, right? And to have this word intersectionality, to be able to describe and name and talk about and conceptualize the experience outside of just the traditional things that they're going to teach you in a standard, counseling program, is so important. This business of being able to name the thing is so important for people to, to be able to fully realize and actualize themselves, and for society to do the same thing. So I'm a fan, and I just want to thank you so much.
Well, I want to thank you so much for another example that you've been given us, because, again, I think part of the distortion is to frame intersectionality as an abstract concept that was dreamed up in some ivy-covered, building removed from society. So the reason, actually, I took this up in the memoir is that I wanted people to understand the stories that gave rise to my search for a name that would capture the experience. So this is not simply a product of, thinking absent or apart from a specific context. So intersectionality, I think, is recognizable when you tell people, when I was growing up as a Black girl, there were things that I experienced that were unique to me as a girl who was Black and a Black person in mid-20th century who was a girl. Not having a name for it made it sort of misty, made it unclear as to where it was coming from, and more importantly, made it that much more difficult to make any kind of demand or expectation to other people in my community to stand in for and up for, fuller, more inclusive strategies. So allowing people to see it allows people to say, oh, this is part of my own life. I've seen this. I've experienced that, rather than this is a foreign concept that we can just, throw under the bus. And then I want people to ask questions. Well, if this maps onto something that I know or if I've seen, who is trying to persuade us to distance ourselves from these ideas, and what and who is being served by that? When people go after something, it's because it's valuable to the people they're trying to take it away from, and it's probably threatening to the people who don't want them to have it. That's what literacy was all about in the 19th century, and that's what these concepts are about, and it's why they're trying to take it away from us.
So before you go, do you have anything on what you think is the path to more equality going forward, using, critical race theory or intersectionality and the acknowledgement of those and understanding of the realities of those as a frame, either specific policies or approaches to policy, if either accurately, assuming they do accurately describe problems, are there intersectional or CRT-based solutions or approaches to fostering more equality in society that you would emphasize?
Well, I would offer in quick succession two ideas. One that I started with, which is we have to understand color blindness is being used as a weapon to bring white nationalist values and politics to the center of American democracy. That's what's happening with the effort to erase Black and brown voting power. That's what's happening in the effort to remove Black, brown, and other traditionally marginalized people from positions of authority. When they say they want to take America back, they are saying they want to take it from the multiracial democracy and its citizens,
right?
That
but
have
that's,
enjoyed.
And we're going to run out of time. So, but that's the critique, right? That's having to play defense.
Yeah. So you reject the idea of colorblindness. That is the strategy. This is the thing in the misinterpretation. When I tell you that an ideology is serving a certain function, then it should be obvious that the strategy is to to reject the ideology, to say this is not about Martin Luther King. This is about the people who assassinated Martin Luther King. To say that this country is better off without talking about race is to do a racist act. So when you see a racist act, when you see marginalization, your objective must be to talk back against it, to mobilize against it, not to be persuaded that what they are trying to do is restore a democracy that is functional. What they're trying to do is to return to a broken democracy, which we cannot afford.
Professor Kimberlé Williams Crenshaw teaches law at both Columbia and UCLA. She is also co-founder and executive director of the think tank, the African American Policy Forum, and she hosts the podcast Intersectionality Matters. Her new book is called Backtalker, an American memoir. And if you want to see and hear more, she will be at the New York Public Library, Stephen A. Schwartzman Building. That's the main branch, 42nd and 5th Avenue, with Farah Jasmine Griffin, Wednesday evening this week, May 13th at 7 p.m. Now, in-person tickets are sold out, I'm told, but you can register for the live stream. They'll live stream that event. We've put a link on our website, or you can find it on the library's website, nypl.org. Professor Crenshaw, thank you so much.
Always a pleasure.
WNYC's journalism and storytelling is heard by millions of passionate listeners. Sponsors of our programming gain our listeners' attention and their respect. Learn about how your organization can support WNYC and WNYC Studios at sponsorship.wnyc.org.